as always, what I'm trying to do here is to engage with arguments and think about the reasoning components of an argument and discuss the reliability of those reasoning components. So I want to know not only what claims people are making and not only what data they're using, but also what they think the connection between the data and the claim is, and why they think that that is sufficient. So again, I'm not so much trying to reach definitive conclusions on topics here. I may have my own biases or reasons for thinking things, but again, it can totally be the case that all the arguments that someone makes have fallacies in them, or are clearly fallacies, but the conclusion that they've reached is still correct. And another side can have really good arguments, but we can't think of the ways that they are wrong. We don't have enough information yet. So that's what I do. That's what I'm going to do here. Today I want to kind of cover an older topic. It's still being debated, but it's pretty old. The evolution versus creationism debate. And then I want to talk about maybe some of the things that I would do in this situation or this debate, and also some of the questions that I might ask. Let's see. So I'm gonna push that button. Is that right? And then this button. Did that work? Yes, that worked. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, thrilled to have...
Okay, so debating might not be the best way to put what I do. So I am going to kind of skip the evolutionists' intro and talk about probably how I would do it and go into analyzing Kent Hovind's arguments. Really what I think the best way to describe what I'm trying to do with all this is I'm trying to understand how other people build knowledge, or how they claim to build knowledge. And I want to compare that. And hopefully even reconcile the way they build knowledge with the way that I build knowledge, or with the way that I understand other people build knowledge. Everybody from scientists to laymen to academics, to really see if there's any common ground that can be found along those lines. And then, so we may not resolve, everything in the world, but we can start to create a solid basis for how to determine what's true mutually, and use that to have more productive and cordial conversations. So let's see if I can demonstrate that in this video. Let me go ahead and skip. Let me see, is this working?
That's why we
Okay, yeah.
will not tonight. So I got to give you a heads up.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see.
Go over with is Kent really pushes the fact that he does.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to skip over this part. I've never been in a debate like this, at least in front of people. I've talked to people about evolution and why I believe it. Again, I think it's better and it's more productive to have a conversation about the reasons that we use to build certain ideas or beliefs. So what I may do in this scenario is I would probably just pick on a couple of the strongest examples that I would use to support evolution. He's taking the affirmative, this actually isn't a traditional debate in that there is no affirmative and negation. There are literally just two perspectives, two different conclusions. So what that means is it can absolutely be the case that evolution is not true, and that doesn't mean creation's true. This isn't true. This isn't affirmative. It's not like he's taking the affirmative that evolution does exist, and Kent Hovind is taking the negation that evolution doesn't exist. his position just happens to, the negation happens to be more of a byproduct. And then also the reverse is true. If creation isn't true, it doesn't mean that evolution is true. So just to establish kind of my responsibility as the person taking the side of evolution, I would probably point to electrophoresis, which is a process that we use to compare DNA. We use it to compare the similarities and the differences, and I would probably maybe pick on like ERVs, endogenic retroviruses. So I'm not really interested in, I know who Kent Hovind is. I've listened to him a lot. I have certain ideas and views of him. I guess to be open about my biases here, I do think evolution happened. Again, that is completely separate. It is also the case that creation and evolution can both be true in certain regards and respects. Kent Hovind is a person that I think has a lot of reasoning issues, so I also think it would be productive for that reason to analyze this. I don't find him a particularly pleasant person. I'm also not going to go as far as some other people say, which Mark might be doing here. Maybe he's not, to say that he's some kind of grifter. He knows better, and he's just trying to fool people for money. I think he's just prideful, and I think he's not really interested in so much in whether what he's saying is true or not. He's interested in taking a position and kind of standing by that position no matter what. So with that out of the way, again, I would probably point to the fact that the same study, and I've said this to a lot of creationists, the same experiment that we do to understand the relationship between humans. So for instance, if we want to know if a son is in fact the son of a particular person, or if we want to know if somebody is in fact the cousin of another person, what you do is a DNA test. You do something called electrophoresis, and what that allows us to do is compare not only the similarities. So they would look at you and your cousin, and they would say, okay, you share, let's say 99.99% of DNA, but of that 99.9% DNA, there's, let's say, a 0.001% variation that is only common to your shared grandfather. It is only common to your shared grandfather. So your dad has a brother. Let's say they both came from the same father. Genetic mutations occur every iteration. So you're not just 50% your mom and 50% your dad. You're more like 49.9% your mom. These aren't exact, by the way. So I'm just being open about that. But let's say you're close to 49.9% your mom, close to 49.9% your dad. And now I got to do the math on this to make sure I get it right. And let's say, 0.2% is a variation. It's uniquely you. A mutations have occurred in you naturally that aren't harmful, that distinguish you. And that variation will very highly likely carry out if you have kids. That variation will be able to be seen in all the kids that you have. Everybody who lineage, not only your kids, but their kids, the variation will be seen in their kids. So they can tell that you and your cousin are in fact related and share a common ancestor, your grandfather, because your grandfather accumulated certain variations that aren't going to be apparent in any other human except for that one, and you that will be apparent in the DNA of you and your cousin. So it's the exact same thing between species. So if you compare us to the greater apes, what's called the greater apes, not only do we share a lot of DNA, but the variations between us and the lesser apes, what are called the lesser apes, are shared between us and the greater apes. The lesser apes don't have those variations. The same thing, but we share more of those variations with the lesser apes than we do with, say, monkeys. Certain monkey species. Same thing if you look at mammals. We share not only the commonalities of having the mammal, but a portion of that are variations from all the other species existing, which denotes this. It leads to the same conclusion between species that it does when we do it with humans. So that to me seems to it's a lot like if you were to look at two ends of a tree branch and simply saying, hey, that the two ends spouted from this intersection piece. It's, either that or someone really tried to make it look like that. Like maybe that isn't true, but God or demons or whatever have you really tried to make it look like that. That's what we see when we look at DNA evidence. When we look at the species, what we see is something that looks a lot like branches, things branching off from each other. So that is something that's hard to reconcile with the idea that evolution didn't occur. And then another unique feature of all that are endogenic retroviruses. So there are certain viruses that modify our DNA, and we share those in common with apes to a certain degree, but we don't share them as much, or let's say the major apes, we share them with major apes to a certain degree, but we share them more so than with lesser apes. We do share these markers with lesser apes. We just don't share them as much as with greater apes, but we also share more with lesser apes than we do with other primates or monkeys. So again, that is a very clear, distinct pattern that is showing definitive roots, and it's the same pattern we see when we want to know when humans are related to each other. So it seems pretty fair to me that if you want to say that most people don't doubt when we do electrophoresis on cousins, nobody takes the time to doubt that and say, no, we don't actually believe that you're related to your cousin. Nobody really or we don't believe that you are your father's son. People at that moment think it's completely reliable. It's only when it's this emotionally charged, somewhat political topic that people want to take the time to start to doubt it. So that's pretty damning evidence. To me, that's the strongest. But again, I would just be taking that position so that I could continue the conversation. I'm much more interested in the reasons that Kit Hovind has for his beliefs, not only the belief that creationism is true, but also the belief he is, I think it's fair to say, taking the stance that evolution did not occur, and whether or not those reasons are adequate to accept the conclusions he wants us to accept. And if he's making bad arguments here, I trust the conclusions that he reaches less, and I also I also distrust his ability to, generally speaking, come to correct conclusions. And if the other person does seem to demonstrate and understand that, and if their data does in fact lead to the conclusions, again, like DNA comparison, electrophoresis, endogenic retroviruses, all the analogies we can think of, we would absolutely accept that information in any other circumstance, which again we do, then I say, okay, yeah, that seems to be the case, that evolution did occur, is occurring, and that it quote unquote exists. So let's skip Mark here and see what Kent has to say, because that's the interesting part.
Want to be lying to kids? Let's not lie to kids.
Yeah, so see, again, he's going to accuse Kent of lying. I probably would not take that approach. I'm not so interested. I'm more interested in dissecting his reasons, and then to really just kind of let I think the audience should be making that same analysis. I would make it clear that my purpose here is not to definitively prove evolution and disprove creation. My purpose is to discuss the reasoning behind those beliefs and whether or not those reasonings would be accepted in any other circumstances except for these ones. And I think that can be much more revealing, potentially to Kent, but also to the audience listening. Okay, Kent, let's see what you got.
Okay, I'm curious how an atheist defines what good is. That'd be another story. We'll do that later. Okay.
Yeah.
I take the position that the Bible is true.
He's not
God
curious.
made everything in 6 days, the stars, the universe, the animals, the plants, everything in 6 days, and wrote a book and told us how he did it. There are too many millions of what are called symbiotic relationships that to have evolution, to have the process come here by evolution. Plants require animals. They reciprocate the gases as well as the food supply.
Okay, so we already have an argument. This is great. I'm going to turn on my chat. Yeah. So evolution cannot, and like I said, he is taking the position that evolution didn't happen, not just the position that creation did happen. But the idea here is evolution did not occur. How do you know? Because this is what, on some level, he's making an irreducible complexity argument. So he's saying that things are irreducibly complex. You can't, you can't have things that breathe, or you can't have things that breathe oxygen without things that create oxygen, right? So those things really rely on each other. So, how do you get to, if you were, and then also those things rely on carbon, which is created by the things that breathe oxygen. So what you have is kind of a stalemate there. That's what he's trying to say, right? And this is not really going to include the fact that this isn't necessarily the case just because it's the case now. So right now we are in a situation in which there are things that breathe oxygen, that produce carbon, that the other that plant and certain algae and plants and algae, let's say, take up, and then they then produce oxygen. It seems like that system is reliant, and it could be the case that at some point there was a species that didn't really need oxygen, or didn't need carbon, sorry, and they're as far, this is even what evolution indicates, that there weren't things that needed oxygen until much later in the development of things. So really oxygen, the lungs were invented way after, or actually should I be more specific about this because we have gills? Yeah, species requiring oxygen to survive came after carbon producing things. So and you can think about how that would work.
They're just millions of symbiotic relationships that I think defy an evolutionary explanation. It'd be like saying which evolved first, the bolt or the nut. Well, the bolt and the nut go together, and one's no good without the other, and so and that's not a.
So I mean, this is partly a false analogy. We're talking about two things that were created, that we know were created, right? Which would be different. But the other thing is, you can completely imagine a situation in which, and it actually may even be the case, in which the bolt was created, let's say to like join two sheets of metal together with like a very crude hole, right? And the bolt wasn't made or invented till later. I actually am not even sure that whoever came up with the idea, the bolt or the nut, like did it simultaneously. It seems apparent to me that actually probably didn't happen, that the bolt actually probably was created later, and that you would get something, I would have to do more research on this, but that you could have something, you could imagine a bolt being useful to crudely join two sheets of metal with a hole in it together, and that the idea of screwing something on the other end to make it stronger didn't occur till later. So he's not even really right on the bolt nut analogy, but it's often the case that it's not just so clear cut, That, it's like saying somebody that is juggling 5 balls, like they're moving their arms in a certain momentum. I can't imagine them juggling 4 balls at one time. And it's just like, well, things had to change. They were doing different things at that time. Just because they're doing that now doesn't mean that they were always doing that.
Crude scale compared to the living things, which are billion times more complex. So I do take the position the Bible is true. Now, I do not, we're not asking everybody to pay for our theories and religions to be taught. So the burden of proof is really not on me to prove the creation story. The burden of proof is on...
Misunderstanding the burden of proof is a pretty big one. So he seems to think that because evolutionists do rightly have the burden of proof, he's correct about that aspect. But the aspect that because evolutionists have the burden of proof, that creationists don't have the burden of proof, is completely incorrect. If he was just denying evolution, if he was just saying, I'm just saying evolution isn't true, I'm not saying creationism is true or anything else, then he would be right in saying that he hasn't adopted a burden of proof. But creationism comes as its own distinct claim with a set of assumptions which requires a burden of proof. So again, demonstrating that he doesn't understand that is a big signal for me as somebody who understands that there's a difference between denying a position. So again, he could just deny that evolution did occur, and he would be absolutely right, and taking a position on something else, which he has done here. He's not just denying that evolution isn't true. He is doing that, but he is also taking another position that it was done a different way. Requires a burden of proof.
On you guys who want all of us to pay for your religion to be taught, which is evolution. Nobody's ever seen any animal produce offspring that are different. You mentioned you have zebras and lions, and I said
that was poor wording there on his part. And this may be where I would write it down. He's obviously speaking, so now is not the time to do that. This is probably how I should have started the video. That's what I wanted to do originally, but he said nothing has produced. I just want to make sure I'm getting him exactly right, but nothing has produced anything that's different. And I do actually know what he means there, and I could go based off of what he means, but I think this would be a place to challenge him and start to show some issues in the way that he's building knowledge. Because what he said is that nothing has ever produced anything different, right? Not that one species hasn't led to another, which we haven't seen the offspring of one species be so different that it would warrant categorizing as a different species, which is also partly a misunderstanding of evolution. But he's saying specifically that nothing has produced anything different. We've also seen things create subspecies of themselves that kind of require their own distinct category as species. But the other issue is that what was I going to say? Subspecies, that things create things that are different all the time. You can have one we would know. Again, I am sure where a non sequitur would be used, but it doesn't matter because I want to be able to take people at their word, and hopefully everybody else does too. That's another thing that is an issue in debates, is that we get to a point where I can't take people at their word, but people want to be able to take other people at their word. Like, we'll say that you're a man of your word or this or that, but when it comes to actually challenging somebody else, they no longer want to be people of their word, which is, again, to me, a very moral issue. It kind of shows a lack of moral integrity. So when he says we haven't seen one thing that can produce something different, if I start pointing out genetic mutations, that occur all the time, right? He would probably, my guess would be to change the conversation into something about it being a defect or not gain of function or these things. And it's like, okay, and that's fair, and we can talk about that, but first let's address this idea that you said things don't produce things that are different, right? And so we can take that off the table at the very least. Okay, so I acknowledge things can be created that are different. I'm saying there's nothing that can be created that, and then he'll get into the particulars of gain of function, so on and so forth.
Said, do you think they have a common ancestor? And you said, well, if you go back a long time. Well, Mark, that's a religious belief. You can't observe that. We don't see this happening.
Okay, so this happens a lot, and again, it's a bad sign for people who take these positions or people who reason this way. Okay, there's a difference between observing something directly and making inferences based off of other observations. We do it all the time, and it's completely, Christians do this. Creationists. Kent Hovind believes that he has a great-great-great-grandmother. Kent Hovind has never, I'm fairly confident in making that inference, that Kent Hovind has never seen his great-great-great-grandmother. But I am positive, pretty positive, that he thinks he has one. He doesn't need to observe her, though. Why? Because he's heard stories about her, or he has observed other people living, or he just understands that that's generally a concept of how human biology works, how sexual reproduction works. He knows that, so he's made the inference that his great-great-great-grandmother has existed through other observations. So this idea that like you had to be there in the past to observe it, that never comes up as a criteria for accepting something up until we're talking about, again, something that's emotional and something that is on some level political. So Mark and a lot of other evolutionary biologists and biologists have come to the conclusion that evolution did occur and is occurring because of other observations they've made that have allowed them to make a strong inference that evolution has occurred and it is occurring. You do not need to see it even directly, even though we also have seen it directly, or there are experiments that show certain things happening that we would expect given evolution being true. We have experiments indicating that those things do happen. So again, right there, I can look at him and I can say, oh, he's reasoning poorly on this. This does not bode well for accepting his own conclusion on this topic. And also it brings into question his abilities to reason generally, which also makes me trust him less. Both of those are fair conclusions given that information, I would argue. Anybody can argue that that shouldn't be the case. I would be interested to hear that. That's what the show is about.
All you're ever going to see is your lions produce lions and your zebras produce zebras. That's all anybody has ever seen.
Yeah,
and so science...
You can state that as a fact. We even have examples that I think he would accept as true and a lot of people accept as true. We have subspecies of dogs that create. It's like saying a wolf can never create what we'd call a dog, or a terrier can never become a rat terrier, right? It's like, no, yes, things change and adapt, right? We have something that we would call I don't want to get the jargon wrong, but that we would call like wolves or what is it? Canis, I think. I might be getting that wrong, but that those can change into what we now call dogs and understand as something different than wolves, even though they can actually, some of them can copulate, some of them can't. So it's just like, what do you do with those? That's something that is, again, indicating that things will change and adapt, even in terms of gain of function, right? Like wolves have sharp, pointy ears. We have hounds with floppy, low ears, right? That allow them to do something different that the wolves cannot do. That's a gain of function, right? And it also gets to the point where sometimes the species are so genetically diverse that they can actually no longer reproduce together. And those are two things that you really need for evolution to be true. And what Kent Hovind is really failing to prove isn't the case. So we haven't seen a lion become another lion because we're here with lions. Like, they're here now. We haven't seen that happen yet. We've seen things that can be classified as a subspecies. And then also some species can become more static depending on the condition, but Yeah, I mean, how would I guess the issue here is I'm not putting these in the forms of questions. So let me think about, I would ask him, like, does he think that dogs evolved from wolves or from a wolf-like species? That's also the way to understand it. It's not necessary. It's not like dogs evolved from the wolves that are here today, right? They evolved from a wolf-like, both the wolves that are alive today and the dogs that exist, both share a common ancestor long ago that was a wolf-like species. It was adapted to environments that are more like the environments that wolves are in today, which is why wolves, if you look at the older, what would be the renditions of them or their skeletons, they were much more like the wolves of today than they are like the dogs, and it's because the environment that they're in is much more like the environment that they were in is much more like the ones that the wolves are today. Dogs we've created artificial environments for them. So yeah, again, you can think of this a million different. Dogs are a great analogy to use for evolution because that is, they look so different from each other, and some of them can't reproduce. A lot of them can, but some of them can't reproduce together, and gain of function. A lot of the things that you would want to see there that creationists say you would need that don't exist actually exist in looking at the evolution of wolves and dogs.
Science deals with what we can observe, study, and test. I hold the position that God made the animals and plants and said they will bring forth after their kind, and that's all that's ever happened. And whether we know what kind it is or not, where to classify it in our brain doesn't matter. They know. We have all kinds of animals here, and our donkeys show no.
That is an awkward way to put that they know.
No interest whatsoever in the turtle. They don't want to mate with the turtle. They just ignore it completely. African spurred tortoise.
Yeah, that doesn't mean that they know. There's something called instinct, right? But I'm gonna leave that alone. That's actually, I would try not to bring stuff up like that in a debate or even a conversation about this stuff.
100 pounds. So the animals certainly know what kind they are. I do teach that.
And there are a bunch of videos out there, which is really funny, of like animals humping things that aren't them, like of their kind, let's say, right? And in fact, there's videos of like not only them humping something that is a different species than them, but something that like isn't even like an animate object. They're humping inanimate objects that are different species, like a moose humping. I think if I'm recalling correctly, there's a video of a moose humping a statue of a bear. So not only can it not tell that it's not animate. So again, that's where I might be like, well, what would you think about this? What do you think about these situations where we have animals, has this guy never got... What do you think when a dog humps the leg of a human? What do you think's happening there? Or it humps a bear, right? What does he think about that? How does that fit into what he just claimed about animals knowing the difference, right? That would seem to call his reasoning into question. I'd focus more on him and what he thinks.
That the Bible says there was water above the firmament. In Genesis chapter 1, God made water above the firmament, and it is my theory, and many other people believe this, that it was probably a layer of ice 2 or 3 inches thick, maybe 10 miles up, that contained the whole atmosphere. I think anybody that studies anything about earth science or the atmosphere would agree the atmosphere we're in today has layers to it. Troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, thermosphere, exosphere, ionosphere. There's no question the atmosphere that we're in is stratified, layered. So that's certainly not a problem. To have another layer containing all of it, a layer of ice, if the layer of ice was in contact with outer space, where it's minus 452 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 171 Celsius or whatever the temperature is, almost absolute zero, then it would stay frozen like an Eskimo's igloo stays frozen. with he can build a fire inside. It can be 60 degrees inside an igloo, and he can't melt the roof because it keeps conducting the heat away. So, but the ice canopy theory is not something that all creationists believe, and it's not something at all we're demanding everybody pay for that to be taught. I do believe if you took all the air that's currently around the Earth and squeezed it into 10 miles, it would increase air pressure at the surface. Today is 14.7 pounds per square inch. I forget what that is in metric, but I used to know. I forgot.
I don't know whether or not to address the thing he keeps bringing up about evolutionists insisting that what they believe and what they think they know being taught in schools. I can say that there are reasons we teach things in schools and reasons we don't. I gave my argument as to why I think evolution does exist, and I think that that is not something that's been effectively rebutted yet. So in terms of a theory, it's been established as a good scientific theory, which is what we want to teach in schools. We want good scientific theories or models or facts to be taught in schools. We want the things that aren't facts, and we want there are lots of theories out there, but the ones that aren't accommodating for all the facts, the ones that aren't being demonstrated to be true, those are the ones that we don't teach. And so the idea of ice over the firmament, as far as I understand, it not only needs more data, which we've talked about, right, but it actually needs a conversation to be had about whether the data that's being purported to prove that is true is sufficient to meet the burden of proof that that claim has. Okay, so as far as I know and understand, evolution has met that burden of proof, and the firmament, the ice firmament, just hasn't. So that would be why. Now, I know that may not be acceptable to him, but that's all. There's also no questions in there. So again, I would probably strike all that. This is kind of stream of thought, but I would go back to the questions that I was asking earlier. I might just end up ignoring this whole thing about it being taught in schools and not being taught, or, their ideas being taught in schools and the ideas of scientists and evolutionists being taught in schools.
Doesn't matter. If you increased air pressure, that would explain lots of things that we see. We find fossils of animals that are huge.
I also want to point that it seems right now, it seems like a non sequitur, some of this stuff. So, I may ask him, like, what is the relationship? Does there being a firmament around the earth mean that evolution didn't occur, and why? If it does mean that, then why does a firmament being around the earth mean that evolution didn't occur?
Couldn't survive in today's atmosphere. They find bird fossils with 50-foot wingspan, like the one in, I think it's the Smithsonian or someplace, got a giant eagle with probably a 30-foot wingspan. They simply couldn't fly today. And the air's too
he's right
thin.
about that.
They find dragonfly fossils with 50.
Also might be a good time to, sometimes write down what they say that's correct and be like, yeah, I agree. I agree that a lot of the species that have existed, let's keep in mind that, like, sharks are very old, right? In terms of the fossil record, sharks seem to have been around way before trees, right? But that is because of the particularity of the environments that they lived in and the adaptability of that species.
3-inch wingspan. There's no way that thing could fly.
But yeah, I would be like, the common ground that can be built there is, it would be hard and near impossible for a lot of the species that have existed, not only the ones that we know of, but the ones we don't know of, to exist today. They wouldn't be well suited for the environments and would probably die.
Let alone breathe, because insects breathe through their skin, through the spiracles. So there's a very serious surface area to volume ratio problem. As any creature gets larger, it has less skin compared to its body volume. Example, you take a 1-inch cube, it has 1 cubic inch of volume and 6 square inches of skin. But if you double it to 2, it now has, so the 1 inch is 6 to 1. If you double it to 2 by 2 by 2, It's 8 cubic inches, but only has 24 square inches of skin.
I do also just want to point out that one thing, this has nothing to do with what I would ask in a situation, but he does seem to be wanting very badly to play teacher here. He's giving a lot of, and the reason I'm saying that is because he's giving a lot of extraneous information that doesn't really matter in terms of his own argument. He seems to want, he's trying to build some type of credential in the eyes of the audience that he is a well-informed person. And unfortunately, like, it works, and it's also not something I can necessarily fault him for in particular, because so many people do it. And it's also just understandable because we live in a rhetorical world. We live in a world where people don't just acknowledge the validity of what we say. They don't just acknowledge the data that we give and the validity of our arguments, or the soundness of our arguments. They acknowledge what we look like and what our intonations are and how we sound or how we come off. They make judgments about whether or not we're right or wrong based on those things, instead of just, again, what's our data? Does our data, what's our claim? What's our data? Does our data reasonably lead to the claim that we say it does, or can we think of reasons that it actually wouldn't? We focus on other things. And so he is very much playing that part in terms of trying to build up his credentials by saying stuff that does not rebut what he is saying, and also does not add to his own argument about creation. Does not rebut what Mark is saying, and does not add to the argument that Kent is giving as somebody who doesn't believe in evolution and as a creationist.
So it just dropped to 3 to 1. So it went from 6 to 1 to 3 to 1. As it gets larger, the problem becomes more exaggerated. As you get smaller, a little tiny bit of body mass can be supported with a huge, it's mostly skin. That's why insects can fall out of a tree and doesn't bother. They just hit the ground and land and walk off. There's so much surface area that they can't fall very fast. So I take the position the fossil evidence is absolutely conclusive. Something was very different on this planet in the past at some time. Now, I believe that's explained by
common ground,
the increased air pressure, and that canopy, a couple inches of ice, which is what the Jews have always taught. The canopy had there was 3.
Okay, and so again, there is a bit of a reasoning issue here, in that he's saying that it has to be. He seems to be indicating that it has to be solely oxygen, and there can be a variety of reasons that species were different. That wouldn't just because it's this thing doesn't mean it's not these other things. I think that's in here, which would also be a reasoning mistake.
3 inches, 2 to 3 fingers of ice above.
So again, to turn that into a question, I might just ask, is the fact that the increased levels of oxygen being part of the reason that species were different back then, does that mean that that is the only reason that species were different back then?
Of the atmosphere. It's now gone. That fell down at the time of the flood. You asked me to defend that. So is it possible? And if not, you want me to just say it's magic? I don't think there's anything magic necessary. If you get ice cold enough, it becomes magnetic. You can hold a statically charged comb your hair, comb your beard, and get static in your comb and hold it next to a stream of water coming out of your kitchen faucet. You'll see water can be attracted or deflected by static charges, and it certainly has been proven at super cold temperatures. Ice can be levitated by a magnet. So the idea of a couple inches of ice levitated either by the magnetic field or held up simply by the air pressure, like a big inflatable building, I don't think it's a problem. But again, I'm not asking for that to be taught. That's just my theory. I think it explains the giant animals partially.
So again, misunderstanding the idea of a scientific theory. If he really has the data to back it up and those reasons do point to his conclusion, he should insist that it be taught. And he's also conferred with other experts on that information. That are also gathering data and carefully considering the construction of their arguments. Then they collectively should do that. I don't think that that's been done. And again, I would start to ask, how does the fact that or how does his belief that there was a firmament mean that God created the earth in 6 days and this and that? This is also a mistake that's made by, unfortunately, a lot of religious people. I don't want to get too much into the conversation about the Bible or religion. I'm not the type of person to try to destroy other people's beliefs. I'm more actually interested in the commonalities on that. But what often does happen is somebody will point to something that we know is true that's in the Bible and say, so the whole thing must be true. And again, that's a reasoning error, right? Like let me think of a softer way to do this, which I really can't do. But you can imagine somebody, there are biographies out there that we know are false. So what that means is there's even the vast majority of the thing is true, but certain facts can still be incorrect. So any one fact being true doesn't mean that the rest of them are true. Or you can, what would be you can have a novel that is set. What would be a good? It's like saying Tom Sawyer exists because he clearly in the books he roamed around in locations that clearly existed. So therefore, the fact of his existence must also be true, right? We can think of plenty of reasons that we just would not accept the relationship between that data and that claim. So we should also reject it in that too, just because even granting that the firmament existed, it would not mean that creation or the rest of the Bible was true. It would just mean that one fact was true. The other pieces of information have to fall or stand based off of the data we have for them.
Plus, a couple inches of ice would block out nearly all of the UV light and the dangerous things coming from the sun. The sun produces a lot of stuff besides just light. Things that are dangerous, that give you skin cancer and give you wrinkles and cause you problems in all life forms. So a canopy of water or ice above the atmosphere 10 miles would block most of that out. So I'm not relying on magic. I think there's a scientific, logical explanation. Super cold ice is magnetic. The Earth's magnetic field is declining. That's measurable. They've measured the decline of the Earth's magnetic field. That's why they think the magnetic field may flip, which I don't buy at all. I don't think it could, let alone ever did. It never did flip. But the declining magnetic field indicates that.
Yeah, I won't get into that. There's very clear information. There's very clear data indicating that it did. But and maybe he has an explanation for that. But he's also creating some other type, so it's like very cold ice can be magnetic. I believe that very cold ice surrounded the Earth. The cold ice firmament is no longer there, I guess. I'm assuming that part. And the magnetic field is declining, so the magnetic field is changing. So therefore, the ice firmament did exist, right? So it's like, just because that's one way that a magnetic field exists doesn't mean that's the only way, right? So it could be for instance, churning centrifugal core. I'm not using that word right, but whatever. It could be that the center of the Earth is spinning at such speeds that it's acting as a sort of magnetic engine. So again, it doesn't have to be that, right? There's evidence that indicates that that's the case, but the point is, just because you can think of one way that something is the way that it is, that does not mean that that is the way that it did in fact occur. You need other information. So again, a reasoning error on his part there.
It used to be stronger, which would easily hold the canopy up even better if it was stronger. So I don't like kids to be lied to. That is correct. I think we're lying to the kids when we tell them we have scientific evidence that zebras and lions have a common ancestor if you go back far enough. That might be a religious belief, but it's not scientifically observable. The zebra's been having babies for a long time. They're always zebras, without exception. And you mentioned about the dew claw. I'm kind of surprised. I've never heard an evolutionist or an atheist.
I would wonder if he thinks that horses and zebras potentially share a common ancestor, right? Because then we could hopefully get to a place where he would acknowledge that things weren't necessarily zebras. That there was some previous form that had qualities of both horses and zebras. What we call that, ungulates, I think. That eventually developed into what we now recognize as a modern day zebra. I'm curious.
You try to use that one as evidence. The dew claw on the dogs is not a knee halfway up the back. The dew claw is something they use all the time. They can barely move it, but it is attached. It's not a useless appendage. Just Google dew claw. And I think you'll find it's been known for a long time that it does have a use, and it's not vestigial. It's not losing anything. It's just part of the dog's anatomy. We have 4 fingers and a thumb that are all opposable. I suppose you could live with only 3 fingers or 2. Why do we have 4? It's the way it's designed. We use the little finger. It's not near as powerful as the index finger, but it can be used. So I think that'd be a poor argument for evolution, even if it were true, because that would be an example of losing something, not gaining something. I have yet to see any atheist.
Okay, so he lost me on that.
Always zebras, without exception. And you mentioned about the dew claw. I'm kind of surprised. I've never heard an evolutionist or an atheist try to use that one as evidence. The dew claw on the dogs is not a knee halfway up the back. The dew claw is something they use all the time. They can barely move it, but it is attached. It's not a useless appendage. Just Google dew claw.
Okay, so there seems to be like several implications here that are problematic. So one is my guess, again, I didn't listen to the intro, so I could be wrong about this. And if I am, then I would have to recant. But my guess is that Mark did not say that the dew claw was useless, or that knees are useless. He seems to be implying one or the other, and nobody's arguing those things. And it's not that things necessarily become useless in evolution. The things that usually become useless go away just as a byproduct of the fact that the energy used to create those things is a waste. So species using that energy for that instead of something else tend to not survive. But yeah, so that's an issue. The fact that he's interpreting it that way as useless. So I don't think Mark was saying. My guess would I bet money that Mark was saying that it's not useless, or Mark wasn't saying that it is useless. And the thing that he's really trying to indicate is that the necessary parts for modification are still there. So this is kind of like the hip bone argument of the whale, which I'm sure Kent Hovind would rebut by saying that they're necessary. Nobody's saying they're not necessary. The point is that they indicate common lineage as morphological data that indicates that the same parts are being used through lineages. So in terms of the dew claw on a dog, the fact that can readily correspond to the bones found in the structure of bones found in the vast majority of other what would be the best way to put that, animals. Yeah, I think it's safe to put it that way. It corresponds. They're still there, right? Now let's say land walking animals. Yeah. Land of limbed creatures. Yeah, we would actually have to say that. Fish do not have that. Things that are categorized as fish do not have those things, right? They don't have hips. So again, it's just data that those things are corresponding. So again, the fact that he can't describe, again, I'm not putting it in the form of questions. I need to get better about that. I think I might ask him. I might not even address it at all.
And I think you'll find it's been known for a long time that it does have a use, and it's not vestigial. It's not losing anything. It's just part of the dog's anatomy. We have 4 fingers and a thumb that are all opposable. I suppose you could live with only 3 fingers or 2. Why do we have 4? It's the way it's designed. We use the little finger. It's not near as powerful as the index finger, but it can be used. So I think that'd be a poor argument for evolution, even if it were true, because that would be an example of losing something, not gaining something. I have yet to see any atheist or evolutionist give an
That
example
I'm not sure what he's talking
of
about, but
any
whatever.
nascent organs, something we are gaining. It's always vestigial organs. We're losing the appendix, they think. We're losing this and losing that. There used to be 180 vestigial organs on the list of things the body didn't need. That was back in 1902 or something. Now they found a use for all of them. There are no vestigial organs. But even if there were, that is the exact opposite of what you guys need. You need something coming on, not something leaving. Okay, so my introduction is, I believe the Bible is true. God made.
Yeah, so again, I think the ears getting, longer, that's sort of what evolution does. I guess he wants something that's, he wants, a horse with wings, and that is just not the way that evolution works. That's what he wants, but that again demonstrates that he doesn't understand what the opposing argument is, or the burden of proof that it requires to prove that thing. So
Everything. It was completely destroyed by a worldwide flood. There's certainly enough water in the ocean now to completely cover the world. There's enough water in this cup of right here to completely cover the world if you spread it real thin, microscopic level. So there's plenty of water to cover the earth about 1.5 miles deep if the earth were smoother, and I don't mean flat. It is round and it spins. I can't believe these flat earthers, and I appreciate you taking them on. Now there you're right, but Mark, you're wrong about evolution. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. We'll go into the open discussion.
One of the great challenges in this world.
all right, let's see what happens in the open discussions just a little bit, and then I'm done. Let's see. That's an appropriate ad.
Boy, Kent, for somebody who talks about having one conversation at a time, you do bring up a lot of stuff. That's okay. I guess so did I. So what I'm getting at, Kent, is there's just things we know cannot work. How can we possibly take a piece of ice and let's just look up at the sky? Let's pretend that we're in Texas and we're looking up in the sky. What would ever hold a piece of ice 1.5 inches thick? Like I'm holding 3 fingers up. Yeah, about 1.5 inches. How could that possibly be held up in the atmosphere? And
again, these things are tangential, so he's bringing it up. I would probably just ignore this. I don't really care. The conversation is about evolution. It has some relation to creationism, but not really. I think mostly what we're talking about is, were things created as one aspect, and were they created within a 6-day span, in the same time frame, or was there a development of species over time? Whether or not they were created, they may have been created, right? That's also a possibility. The point is, it seems to me that's really the topic of discussion, and that should probably just be focused on.
And just to say, look, I'm not asking for my theory to be taught to children, but you are telling children this. So are you telling them the truth, or are you lying, is what's really tonight's discussion is going to be about. Just to say that tax dollars aren't going into paying for this, could you really imagine a piece of ice 1.5 inches thick surviving at whatever that height is that you're talking about and holding this extra atmospheric pressure? Like 1.5 inches of ice is nothing, Ken. And what happens when we get a piece of space, whatever, rocks, and it hits this? Is that not going to be a hole where we're going to start releasing this pressure? I just do not see how a piece of ice 1.5 inches thick could hold any pressure. And when you talk about it being magnetic, I actually look.
That might be fallacious on his part. I think I've made a similar mistake just recently, but I'm not sure, so I don't want to speak on it too much.
It up. Yes, it does become semi-magnetic, but we're not talking like iron here. We are talking on the smallest of scales. That this.
Yeah, that is like a big. There is a difference between something becoming like the potentiality of something being magnetic, in terms of like static and ice, and like iron, it may take much more. But just because you can't think of why something didn't occur doesn't mean that it didn't. So that would be something to think about in terms of what Mark is saying.
Stuff becomes magnetic, the way that it lays itself out on a molecular level. Yes, you are right. It kind of becomes magnetic, but not in a way that if you were to take a magnet and stick it to the piece of ice, it would stick to it. That's just really misrepresenting. Everything has a gradient, and this ice is really not magnetic in the sense that you could take the strongest of magnets, try to stick it to it, and you would not even feel a attraction. So again, I say to you, what would stop you're using this ice to say that it built up all this pressure, and that's what made all these insects so big, and I understand what you're saying, but really, do you think we could take a piece of ice, let's just say 100 feet by 100 feet by 1.5 inches, and really suspend it anywhere without it just falling apart? Like, this is ice, Ken. This isn't steel. This isn't
Okay.
Could we really do that? Let's tell the kids. You want to be honest with kids.
Yeah, I mean, that would actually be an interesting experiment to run to see if Kent could make that happen as well. Yeah, that's a really good question.
We really expect to take a piece of ice, even 50 feet by 50 feet, 1.5 inches, and what's going to hold this up there?
Well, let's take this a little bit at a time. First of all, I've never said there was a piece of ice held up. I said there was a complete sphere. I just looked up the world's largest inflatable building. The Goodyear hangar stands tall in America. Tested in a farmer's field in the Midlands, it's now the world's largest inflatable building in California. It can hold airplanes. And they got all kinds of stuff on the internet about, do you really believe a piece of canvas could be held up in the air? Yeah. If it's complete and intact, certainly.
Absolutely.
No, you are missing.
Yeah, but he's missing the component where he's talking about like magnetically. Like if you put a thin piece of iron, that would be one way. If you put a thin piece of iron throughout that ice sheet, maybe it's possible, right? But that's not what Ken Hovind said. He could certainly go there, though.
Misrepresenting my argument to say a piece of ice 50 by 50. I would say a piece of canvas 50 by 50 can't be held up in the air either.
No, Ken. I would, a piece of canvas 50 by 50, we see it every day. What we don't see is people being able to pick up a piece of ice. Let's even take it smaller, 1.5 inches by 10 by 10. Ice is very
true. No.
So are you okay? Sorry, Ken. Go ahead. Or do you want me just to answer that quick? So are you saying to me that if we were to take a piece of ice 1.5 inches,
teach that to kids?
Oh, for sure. I would rather them be taught. Well, no, Ken. Don't just throw your hands in the air. I would rather them be taught that there is any possibility that we could even take a piece of ice that's 1.5 inches thick by 10 feet by 10 feet.
That's a made-up story.
I might be done with this.
And you said something so bizarre. I've never met an evolutionist who understands what they're saying. You say when we look back in the geologic column, Mark, all of the layers on the Earth are the same age. Are you saying the top one is younger? Did it come from outer space? Where do these new layers come from? All the layers are the same age. They were shuffled up in a big flood and stratified. You can get a
Okay. So I think I already know what Mark's going to say here. I wonder if there's a question. So like, that might just be a misunderstanding. What question could you ask to really point out the issues with this? Because really it's just that they were the top layer at the time. That's really what we're trying to get at. But
jar of dirt and do that in 5 seconds in your hand. But why do you guys... You're really good at debunking the flat earthers, and they don't realize how dumb some of the things they say are. I don't think the evolutionists realize how dumb it is to say the layers are different ages. They're not. They're all on the planet at the same time. They're all the same age. They were just shuffled. So did this younger layer on top come from outer space? Where did it come from? Why is it younger?
Have you never seen wind? Have you never watched the erosions of mountains? Have you never seen earthquakes?
Mark,
Have
I
you
taught- I
never
taught earth
been
science-
to a
I taught earth science
swamp?
for 15 years. I'm very familiar with all that. Taking wind.
Then why
or
are you
water-
then Kent, why are you asking me how we get layers? We get layers
I didn't.
through.
I said, Mark, I didn't say how we got layers. I'm very well aware of erosion.
Right, and those layers developed at different times, giving that layer an age, even though the material may all be the same age, right? So, but honestly, I think Kent Hovind, again, I talked earlier about like being able to hold you to your word. So maybe saying that they're different ages, saying that the material are different ages isn't the best way to put it. No. Saying that the layers are different ages is completely fine, given what Mark just said. So hopefully you can already see the issues again here with the reasoning of Kent Hovind. I can imagine a situation in which I create my own layers. So let's say I take some mud, I put it on top, I let it dry, right? And let's say that happened at 12 o'clock. An hour later, at 1 o'clock, I take another layer of mud and I put that on top, 1 o'clock. And then another layer on top, I put that at 2 o'clock, and then 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, right? And then later on, I can see all those layers, the distinction between them, right? And the fact that they dried at different times, different things have happened to them because they've been exposed to a certain environment longer, and say these layers were developed by me at different times. The layers are different ages, right? Even though the mud is the same age, the layers. So again, it's a reasoning issue. And that's what I think I got. So we're going to stop there. I may come back to this one because I want to hear more of this. Yeah.
And we live in a gravel pit.
And I